Today I wanted to discuss peace in Somalia and why there will be no peace in Somalia anytime soon. Now, Somalia has been going through a civil war from 1992 to present, and these are many generations of people getting born, becoming grown up, and there's still a civil war. So, for a civil war to be sustained for such a long time, it means that there are some external factors sustaining that civil war, because the original reasons for the Somalis to go to war against each other was to remove the dictator called Siad Barre. But Siad Barre has been gone for a long time, so you'd think that peace would come to Somalia because the dictator is gone. But for many reasons, peace never seems to come back to Somalia. Now, why will there never be peace in Somalia? For one very simple reason: it is in no one's interest for there to be peace in Somalia. No one benefits when peace comes to Somalia. Maybe the Somali civilians, but no one else. Now, when you look at the Somali elite doesn't want the civil war to end. In other words, they want the continued threat of terrorism within Somalia. Why? Because as long as there's a threat, a military threat against them, they're able to blackmail foreign countries into giving them money and to giving them resources. And that's how they've become very, very wealthy. So if you take away the Al-Shabab threat, then other countries will not be motivated to give the Somali elite all the resources that they give them. So the Somali elite makes sure that Al-Shabab remains undefeated. It is always there as a boogeyman to be used to spook other countries. So it is not in the interests of the Somali elite for there to be peace in Somalia. That's number one. Number two, a country like Kenya. Kenya stands to gain a lot when there is no peace in Somalia. Kenya does not benefit in any way if peace comes to Somalia. So therefore, Kenya will never take any action to bring peace to Somalia. So how does this work? This works in a very, very easy way. There are millions of refugees from Somalia who live in Kenya. Some of them live inside the country. Some of them live along the border in huge refugee camps that have become entirely brand new towns and almost becoming cities. Now, these refugee towns are sustained by the United Nations, which pumps a lot of money just to, to make sure that the refugees have food, shelter, and resources. So what happens is that the government that is in Nairobi gains tremendously when money is pumped into these refugee camps, because a lot of that money is diverted into the government coffers, as it were. So anytime the elite of Kenya runs out of money, they immediately blackmail the United Nations. When they need, quick money, maybe they need $1 billion or $2 billion, they immediately begin, that is the Kenya government, the Kenya elite, they immediately begin to say that they're going to kick out the refugees, that they're going to shut down the refugee camps. And this makes the United Nations start to beg the government of Kenya and negotiate with them and give them what they want. And most of the time, what they want is money. For example, during the Change the Constitution campaign called the BBI, if you were paying close attention, you could hear that the president of Kenya at that time and the senior members of that leadership, they were always complaining about refugees. And they were doing that so that the UN would send them some money so that they could use that money for that campaign. And as Kenya neared the elections, there were again noises being made about kicking out the refugees in order to blackmail the UN to giving the government money. And that money was diverted into campaigning. So the refugee camps in Kenya work, they work very well for the Kenya elite, because it's a quick source of cash. If you need to blackmail the UN, you have the refugees right there. Which brings about a very interesting question. Why would the UN be so supportive of those refugees? But we'll deal with that later. Now, continuing for Kenya, it is also not in the interest of Kenya for there to be peace in Somalia, because not only about the refugee issue, but also because of the issue about the Somali diaspora. Now, the Somali diaspora sends a lot of money into Kenya because they are unable to invest it in Somalia because of the continuing crisis. So a lot of that money ends up in Kenya. And Kenyans, or Kenya, benefits a lot by having such high financial flows into the country. So you'll notice that anytime Somalia becomes peaceful and quiet, and Al-Shabab is a little bit relaxed, what happens is that some of this Somali diaspora money starts to go back to Somalia, so that the financial flows coming to Kenya reduce and the amount of money going to Somalia increases. And once that happens, normally after several months, you will hear an explosion or an attack in Mogadishu. And immediately, the diaspora funds begin to come back to Nairobi. And it works like clockwork. Anytime a lull in the fighting goes to Somalia, and money begins to leave Kenya, there will be an attack in Somalia, and the money will begin to come back to Kenya. Therefore, that's one more reason why the government that is in Kenya, that has troops in Somalia, they never really attack Al-Shabab to finish them off, because they need that continued threat of attack in Mogadishu in order to make sure that the Somalis don't send money to Somalia, that the Somali diaspora sends and spends money inside Kenya. So you see, it's all about making money. Everyone is making money. So it is not in the interest of Kenya to have peace in Somalia. We can't be losing that kind of money just because Somalis want to live in peace. So Al-Shabaab remains untouched. They just remained contained, always there, ready to attack upon instructions to make sure that the financial flows remain going back to Nairobi. Now, back to the story of the UN. It is also not in the interest of the UN for the war in Somalia to end. Why? Well, the UN benefits a lot when there are many refugees in Somalia and in Kenya, because the UN office that handles refugees makes money from the rich countries by being able to point out projects that they are doing. So if you end the refugee crisis by ending the war, how will they make their money? And you very well know that the UN office for Somalia, which is based in Nairobi, which is a very popular city amongst the Western humanitarian elite, the refugee crisis in Somalia and Kenya has created a lot of good jobs for white people who work for the UN, who are based in Nairobi, and they love their lifestyle. I was talking to one of them, and she was telling me that she would never want to go back. In fact, they were offering her a promotion to go back to New York, and she was telling me that she will not accept the promotion. I was like, why? She was like, there's no, she's living in Nairobi. I said, why? She told me lifestyle. I told her, what do you mean lifestyle? So she said, in Nairobi, I have a driver. I have someone who cooks for me, who washes clothes, who takes care of the house, who takes care of the kids. And if I go to New York, I'm going to lose all that. In Nairobi, I'm living like a queen. In New York, I'm going to be living like a peasant. So I don't live in Nairobi. And that's how a lot of the Westerners who work for the UN in Nairobi feel. It's a fun spot to be. So if you end the refugee crisis in Somalia, and that office is shut down, and all those jobs are lost, what will happen to all those people, all those humanitarian aid workers? They'll have to go, back to their countries and do, ordinary jobs. So you see, again, it is not in the interest of the UN office that handles refugees to have the war in Somalia end, to have peace in Somalia end. You see, so it's in no one's interest except the Somali civilians for there to be peace in Somalia. And so there'll be no peace in Somalia. No one is trying to finish off the Al-Shabaab. No, they want them right there, doing sporadic attacks, because people are making money, people are living good, people are having fancy lifestyles of the crisis in Somalia. And so the crisis will continue indefinitely. The UN is not about to end that crisis. No. They want a sustainable crisis that gives them an additional 20 years, so that when they're doing their reports at the UN Security Council, they can say, oh, we need $10 billion because we have 2 million refugees in Somalia. But if peace comes and those refugees go back home, how will they be able to extract money from the rich countries and live good in Nairobi and in other places? See, people have to make money. So I'm sorry, Somalis, I'm sorry. No peace for you. People have to make money. And you can't be interrupting people's money just because you want peace. The other reason why we can't have peace in Somalia is the United States and Israel. Well, it is not in American interest for there to be peace in Somalia. Why? We know that Americans never forgive, right? They hold grudges for hundreds of years. So we know they are still angry about what happened in the 1990s when, in their attempt to intervene in Somalia and arrest the warlord called Aidid, they were attacked and they lost a lot of men and a lot of aeroplanes, helicopters. But even more important, they were embarrassed and they were not happy, because Americans are Europeans, right? They're European people, and they could not believe that Africans can defeat them. And so they still want to retaliate and revenge about that thing that happened. So once Americans target a country for retaliation, they continue to retaliate for many, many years, whether overtly or covertly. They always try to create problems for that country, and we have numerous examples. You can see the amount of damage they did to Vietnam even after the war. You can see what happened in Nicaragua and El Salvador. They're still undermining those countries even to this day. So that war with America is always a permanent situation. So just for the sake of retaliation, there can be no peace in Somalia. They will never allow Somalia to stabilize one way or another. Because you remember there was a time when the Somali diaspora was sending so much money to Somalia that the Americans started pressuring the government that was in Nairobi to block the transfer of funds to Somalia. And then they also intervened in the, Somalis have like their own system for transferring money from one country to another. I can't remember the name, but the Americans started to interfere with that to try and prevent the money from going back to Somalia, just for the sake of, So that's one motivation. The other motivation is that the United States military has to be at war 24/7, 365 days out of the year. They are on a permanent war footing. Their budget, their military budget, is a war budget. It's not a peacetime budget. So they've been constantly at war since 1945 when you look at their military expenditure. So when you're spending that kind of money on your military, you have to keep them busy. You can't be spending that kind of money and they're not doing anything. So just to keep them busy, you have to either create war or look for somewhere where you can fight, where you can find fighting going on, and you pick a side and you join the fight, right? Because you have a bloated military and you do not want to reduce the size of your military. So because they need to try out new weapons, new ideas, and they need a permanent battlefront, so Somalia is very useful for that. Almost no one monitors Somalia, right? It's in a corner of the world where not very many people know. So you can try out your new weapons, your new tactics in such an environment. And so you need a permanent boogeyman like Al-Shabab, that when you're asked to justify your military expenditure, you can always say, look, there are enemies everywhere. And so they never really defeat Al-Shabaab because it is not in their interest to defeat Al-Shabaab. It is in their interest to make sure that Al-Shabaab never collapses. So you don't want to attack these terrorist groups to the point where they collapse, because then when you kill the threat, then what will your military do the rest of the time? So they just create enough tension to make sure that Al-Shabaab doesn't really collapse and peace really never comes, so that you're in a constant state of war. So again, no one benefits at all from peace coming to Somalia? No one, except Somali civilians. It is in almost every other country's interest for there to be no peace in Somalia. And so that's why it's very difficult for there to be peace in Somalia. Now, the last interest group is, of course, the Al-Shabab themselves. Why won't the Al-Shabab dissolve and join the normal life? Move on from fighting. It's not an easy life to be, half-starved, fighting in the middle of nowhere. Somalia is very dry. It can't be a fun life. So why would they stop? Well, they won't stop because someone is supplying them with money, food, cars, weapons, right? So it is not in their interest to stop because that's what they do for a living, right? They are hired mercenaries. If someone wants to create, a distraction, then you just hire out Al-Shabab to attack something, right? And the newspapers start to talk about that and not talk about something else. You're able to change the subject in the public's mind when you have such proxy groups all over the world, So Al-Shabaab are there doing a job. They're employed to do a job, and someone is sustaining them. It is very difficult to sustain an army. I want you to think to yourself, do you have the capacity right now to create an army? What if you have 1,000 men? Do you have the money to feed them, to house them, to transport them, and to defend them from national armies from attacking? You see, that's very difficult. Someone has to be financing you, giving you rations for food, weapons, capacity, logistical capacity, and even information for you to be able to avoid attacks. So who's the big brother of Al-Shabaab? Who sustains them so that they're able to survive year after year after year after year, living in very difficult terrain where you cannot even find water? Who sustains them? Who pays the salaries? How is the money transferred? You see what I'm saying? So you need to understand that groups like Al-Shabaab have many godfathers. There are very many countries that sustain them in their own interest. And so, like we've already said, it is in no one's interest for there to be peace in Somalia because people have to make money. And we can't have all these large groups of people, of nations, losing money just because Somalis want to live in peace. And so the war in Somalia will never end.